You're all set.
Okay. Good morning. I'm Rachael Paquette, Vice President and founding member of the Anishinaabe Business Professional Association for Northern Ontario, where we advocate for the socio-economic interests of First Nations living in treaties areas 3, 5, and 9, and the Robinson Superior and Robinson Huron treaty areas. I'm a lawyer and a founding partner of Paquette and Associate Lawyers based in Thunder Bay. We have knowledge and experience in the organization and operation of public and private education sectors. Our firm also has expertise in Indigenous perspectives in mining, labor law, employment law, corporate law, child and family services law, human resources, and human rights, just to name a few. Today, I am speaking with Fiona Blondin about the importance of meaningful Indigenous board representation within the mining industry in Canada.
Good morning, Rachel. Thank you so much.
Welcome, Fiona. Fiona is a highly motivated senior engagement and communications advisor who currently serves as a Director of Indigenous Strategy at Cormorant Utility Services based out of Cambridge, Ontario. In September 2021, Fiona was appointed to the Board of Directors at KWG Resources. KWG Resources is an exploration stage company participating in the discovery, delineation, and development of chromite deposits in the James Bay lowlands of Northern Ontario. Fiona hails from the Yellowknives Dene First Nation and Northwest Territories and is a proud granddaughter of the late George Blondin, a highly respected author, storyteller, and Indigenous leader. Her aunt is the Honorable Ethel Blondin Andrew, who was, among other things, the first Indigenous woman elected to Parliament and served for 17 years as an MP. As illustrated in the slide photos, Fiona is also a proud mother of two. Fiona honors the legacy and wisdom of her elders and takes inspiration from her children as she strives to create a better future for all Indigenous peoples in Canada. Fiona began her career over 20 years ago in Northwest Territories, working at Akati Mine, Canada's first diamond mine site. She then went to work in the public sector, service sector in politics at the Ministry of Canadian Heritage, where she became familiar with federal funding distributions to First Nations and other power dynamics in Ottawa that shaped the country. Following this experience, Fiona moved to the consulting firm Ishkanagan under the leadership of former National Chief of the Assembly of First Nations, Phil Fontaine. In her role as consultant, Fiona provided services to First Nations, Inuit, and Métis, people across the country striving for inclusive economic development and positive social impact. Building from her strong cultural foundation and family, and with over 25 years of combined experience in mining, the public sector, and private consulting for First Nation, Inuit, and Métis communities, Fiona now lends her expertise through engagement and support of active Indigenous participation in major resource and infrastructure development projects in Ontario. Fiona understands well how the best path forward in projects involves Indigenous communities. And that's done through truly understanding and supporting the unique goals and vision for respective Indigenous groups. She brings this invaluable perspective to the board at KWG Resources. Thank you so much, Fiona, for talking to us today about Indigenous perspectives and board governance.
Thank you so much, Rachel.
Good. Before we begin, I'd like to provide a brief background and context on board governance and diversity and inclusion in Canada. It's a very cursory look at board governance. So what is a corporate board of directors? For those in the audience who may not know what board of directors are or do, and their important role in governance, this is a very brief overview. So corporate boards of directors are elected either from within or outside publicly traded companies to represent the interests of company shareholders. Directors play a crucial role in setting direction for companies, including how to balance the needs of the business and shareholders with other just as important stakeholders and rights holders, including workers, local communities, the environment, government, and the broader public. Board of directors who are external to the firm are compensated for their contributions, while those who are from within the firm are not given, because they're usually held by senior positions within the organization. Input from outside board of directors is extremely important to ensure independent and objective perspectives are brought into company decision-making and goal setting. In the case of mining firms, where social license to operate can be the most critical factor to ensuring success, outside board input representing rights holders and community views is essential. In January 2020, the Federal Canada Business Corporations Act was expanded to increase mandatory reporting and disclosure on board diversity by publicly traded corporations. For years, board diversity and inclusion had focused primarily just on increasing gender diversity, given predominantly male representation on boards. The January 2020 changes made reporting for visible minorities, including Indigenous peoples and persons with disabilities, mandatory. The assumption is that with this required expanded diversity reporting, corporations will make sure that underrepresented groups get a seat at the table to bring much needed alternative perspectives into decision-making and oversight. But progress remains slow. One striking quote from Osler, Hoskins, and Harcourt's Diversity Disclosure Report from 2020 illustrates just how far we need to go. Only 5.5% of the 217 disclosing Canadian Business Corporations Act company directors are visible minorities. And among the 2023 board positions of the 270 Canadian Corporations Act companies that provided full or partial disclosure on their practices, before July 31, 2020, there were only 7 positions held by Aboriginal peoples. Fiona, all of this hopefully helps to illustrate just how significant your role as a board of director for KWG Resources is. So we'll move on to the questions now. Fiona, you started working in the mining industry over 25 years ago at BHP's Ekati Diamond Mine in the Northwest Territories. It was Canada's first diamond mine. You were there during mine construction through to seeing it become operational. Please tell us a little bit about this experience.
Thank you so much, Rachel, for that kind introduction and information and background. I think before I even kind of share about BHP, I'd just like to say that I'm a proud member of the Yellowknives Dene First Nations. And I think as a member from the Northwest Territories, it certainly shaped my vision and approach to the work that I do to this day, and has impacted my vision for how I conduct myself at a board level and in the work that I engage in daily. I was fortunate to be a part of BHP Diamond Mines as it went from construction into operation. And that's certainly, as a young Indigenous woman, I had the opportunity to really see the impact of Indigenous communities and employment within the mining industry, and a chance to see, you know, when you have at that particular time an Australian company coming into Canada, working with Indigenous communities and a very high Indigenous population. Certainly at that particular time, you know, 25 plus years ago, the focal point of that engagement was around employment. And we got the chance to really see the impact of employment. When you look at an Indigenous community, particularly a remote community, when you have 5 workers from a remote community, those 5 workers bring in an economy of, let's say, $500,000 that wasn't in that remote community previously. And, you know, the impacts to communities and the impacts to families was clearly evident immediately. And, you know, in the Northwest Territories, when there were several Indigenous communities with a high population working at BHP Diamond Mine, including those from Yellowknife, we could really see how impactful that was immediately. And I had the chance to see what it was like to go from construction, where you have people working from all over the country, people from Newfoundland all the way to British Columbia, all working in the Northwest Territories. And then we really started to see that segue into a higher Indigenous population that became full-time workers of BHP diamond mines. And, I look back at that particular time, and, at that time when you needed a grade 12 to be a driver, and that was excluding people from being drivers within BHP diamond mines, there was a transition to alternative grade 12 verification. And, when you started to look at how we could innovate, we started to see many, many more people from the communities start to work in the mines. But that was a very simple beginning for me to be able to see as an Indigenous woman myself. I was recruited by BHP Diamond Mines. My background was in criminology. I was recruited to the mine and being a member of the Yellowknives First Nations. So that really began my journey within mining and Indigenous communities. Thank you, Rachael.
Following the Akati mine, you went to work nationally as a national senior political advisor for the federal government, for Sheila Cox at the Ministry of Canadian Heritage, in addition to advising other federal cabinet ministers. You started your own consulting firm and eventually joined former Assembly of First Nation Phil Fontaine's corporation Ishkanagan, as I mentioned earlier. How did these experiences further shape your desire to support Indigenous-led economic development and participation in major resource projects and ownership?
Well, thank you, Rachael. You know what? I think each of those pieces, when you work in Ottawa, you get a sense of what's happening with national policy issues across the country. You get a sense of where the AFN fits into what transpires in developing a national agenda around Indigenous communities, but also how the federal government responds, digests, and reacts to national Indigenous policy. And I think I really reflect on that time as being instrumental in understanding that we can actually make an impact, that we can actually, as individuals, make an impact in what's happening in our country. I had the opportunity to see individuals that inspired change. And I say that in Ottawa as both the Assembly of First Nations, Inuit communities, Métis communities, and the federal government. I think that I really saw that the policies that we're creating in Ottawa and in the provinces and in our communities actually really do affect the change that we're looking for. And I think that both in Ottawa and then ultimately at my time with Ishkanagan, with Inspire, and then as a consultant with communities, all of those pieces shaped my vision and approach to how I work with Indigenous nations. And I really like how you ended kind of that question, which is around Indigenous ownership. And I really believe that, over the time that I've worked in the sector, we really are coming to a time of Indigenous ownership of whether it's infrastructure, whether it's projects, whether it's electrification, whether it's substations, whether it's energy. Really, there's an opportunity for Indigenous communities to have ownership at this particular point. And that's been an evolution in Indigenous engagement, Indigenous policy, and a transformation in what's happening around the country as a whole. We're really starting to see Indigenous ownership being a focal point for Indigenous communities. And I believe that that is that's something that has evolved over time. And it is the heart of why I do this type of business. It is the heart of why I bring my skill set to KWG, why I bring my skill set to Cormorant, which also owns PowerTel in the north, is because I believe in Indigenous ownership. And I believe that if you're going to work with Indigenous communities, it truly is ownership and high participation that will lead to a productive relationship. Thank you, Rachael.
Thank you much, Fiona. In 2020, you became Director of Indigenous Strategy with Cormorant Utility Services. I read that one of the important factors behind your decision to work for Cormorant was the inspirational decision of one of its primary shareholders, John Risley, and his transformational sale of Clearwater Seafoods to 7 Mi'kmaq communities, including Chief Terry Paul, newly formed East Coast Mi'kmaq Coalition in 2020. Tell us why this connection was so meaningful in your decision to work for Cormorant.
Thank you so much. This is such a key question because it drives my passion in this sector. When John Risley decided to sell Clearwater Seafoods, and he decided to sell 50% to Premium Brands Holding and 50% to 7 Indigenous communities, people were stepping back at the time. These were complicated times that were transpiring in Canada around fisheries and around inherent rights of Indigenous people. And truly, I was inspired by John Risley's approach to step in and to look for solutions and to really tie the environment and what was happening around fisheries and sustainability to the people that were employed at Clearwater, and really aligning his vision around 7 generations of people, 7 generations for the environment, and taking that in a corporate perspective. He wanted to ensure that his people were still here in 7 generations. And I really felt strongly when I saw the courage that he had to step in and to create global Indigenous shareholders that were representing Canada on a global market in seafoods and their perspective to be business owners in this area. I found that to be transformational. And John Risley is the major shareholder for Cormorant Utility. Cormorant Utility owns PowerTel, which is very active in the north and in the mining sector and has a long history. I feel honored. I was honored when I was offered the position for the first time ever at Cormorant Utility as Director of Indigenous Strategy, and as a woman, as an Indigenous woman, to be on the executive and really to create change and to continue with the good foundation of ownership that transpired at Clearwater, and our vision here at Cormorant Utility around ownership for Indigenous communities, and the long legacy that PowerTel has in the north, really bringing all of that synergy together in what we're trying to do with Indigenous communities, with Indigenous partners, and really supporting Indigenous leaders leading now, and stepping back, for us to step back and really look at how do we support that vision that Indigenous communities are setting for themselves in the mining sector, in energy, and in other alternative sectors, mining related infrastructure. All of those pieces are pieces that Indigenous communities, I absolutely believe, should have the opportunity to own before anybody else. A lot of the mines that we work on happen to be on Indigenous community or on traditional lands or near Indigenous communities. We absolutely should be looking at all ownership of all mining related infrastructure, including energy. Thank you, Rachel.
Thank you. In September 2021, as I mentioned, you were elected as a 5th member of KWG Resources Board of Directors, as well as being the only First Nation board representative. You are also the only female and racialized person on the board. Please tell us about KWG Resources and share the significance of the perspective you will bring to their corporate governance and decision-making.
Thank you. That's an excellent question. I think that, as an Indigenous person, as an Indigenous mother, I have strong connections to my community. I have a strong understanding that this is the time for Indigenous communities to lead. I have a strong tie to the environment. And I believe that this was a time for, particularly for the Ring of Fire, that KWG has been actively working on for quite some time. I believe it was time to have a shift And that shift is an Indigenous perspective at the boardroom, Indigenous perspective at the leadership from a corporate perspective, and representation to ensure that what we're seeking as Indigenous people is honored, is leading, and that truly is the corporations that work within the Ring of Fire, with any stakeholders that work within the Ring of Fire. I'm bringing a vision that says Indigenous communities are leading this project. Indigenous communities have the opportunity to own all project-related infrastructure, and I believe in that strongly as a person and as a mother, as an Indigenous person, but I believe that strongly as a board of directors of KWG Resources, that we believe in that. And when I was invited to join the board, I do believe that that was a shift in our thinking, a shift in our approach, and our shift in our vision of understanding that all project-related infrastructure should have the opportunity to be owned by First Nations communities. And that's an absolute. And I shared that vision with the board. And I share that vision with Indigenous communities that are impacted by this project. We absolutely should be engaging in a conversation around ownership and participation, and the vision that Indigenous communities have around power, mining, and all project-related infrastructure. I hope that answers your question, Rachel.
It does. So you've talked about some of the opportunities that you see arising out of your role and what KWG Resources is doing right now. But what are some of the challenges that you see?
I think the challenges sometimes is in the development of the relationship. I think that sometimes the challenges is that there are legacy issues within the project and within the relationships. And certainly when I joined the board, I really felt strongly that this was an opportunity to begin that good relationship that is based on respect, honoring, and understanding the vision that the communities have for the project, and not just the corporate side, not just public policy side, and not just the government, but truly when we understand the vision for the region, for the Indigenous nations, that we approach that in a good way, and that we approach that with a place of honor and respect for Indigenous communities because they were here before Canada was even Canada. And will continue to be here for generations. And they have a deep investment in the region, in the environment, and in their vision around the development of an economy for that region. I do believe that, particular to the Ring of Fire, it will require multiple different stakeholders to support this project moving forward. But really, the core is from the Indigenous nations to lead this project. And I did see a change in that as we started to see Webequie and Martin Falls First Nations lead the EA process as proponents. I really felt that, that was a step that illustrated Indigenous leadership from that particular region. And I applaud the vision to move forward with their own vision. And so I do believe that there are lots of challenges, but I also can see all across the country, there are opportunities where Indigenous nations are leading projects and taking control of the vision around that project as partners. And I can see that shift happening across the country, but I also see a shift happening socially across the country. We can't help but as a country be transformed by what has happened around Indigenous children in residential schools for the last year and a half to 2 years. And I do believe that there is a more of an openness, and that is also an openness from corporations that are people who are understanding what we have gone through, and why we are where we are today, and why it's important to develop those good relationships, because it's time for us to support and respect the vision forward. And I'm bringing that with me to both KWG and to this project.
Thank you, Fiona. There may be a little bit of overlap now with the next question, but I think you may be able to add more based on our discussion that we had yesterday. Why do you think KWG's approach to resource development is a good one for Indigenous communities?
Because I believe that it's an absolute. I believe that we at KWG are starting to really take a look at ourselves. We're starting to really think about how we are shifting our approach and how we vision the Indigenous communities leading. I think that we're at a point at KWG when we see that there should absolutely be an opportunity for every single community to have ownership of all project related infrastructure. And I'll even push that further. At some point in the future, I hope to one day see an Indigenous utility owned by the Indigenous communities. I believe that that is something that we absolutely can see and vision happening for the communities if they choose to go in that direction, and really take a leadership role from a corporate perspective and from a utility perspective for that region, and that project related infrastructure can be a part of that utility. So I really think that we're starting to have those open, good conversations around the board, around KWG, around our resources, that we know we're in partnership. We know it was time to pivot, and it's okay to say that. It was time for us to pivot and to have a rethink of our approach. And that's just not at KWG. I think that rethink and evaluation of those approaches are happening all across the mining sector. And we're really rethinking how and why we're supportive of Indigenous nations. And I absolutely believe in ownership. It is the heart of why I do this kind of work. And I believe that at KWG, we've taken that shift and pivot. And now we're really rethinking how we're approaching the Ring of Fire and how we're approaching those good relationships and how we can support Indigenous communities in their vision, as opposed to us trying to lead. It is time for us to step back, and it is time for Indigenous communities to vision for themselves and for us to understand what that vision looks like.
Thank you for that answer. The final question that we have for you relates to the commodity rail line. So KWG is proposing a commodity rail line only for chromite transport from an underground mine. I think they're proposing that First Nations should own that infrastructure, and that this rail line and the underground mine will be the least intrusive means by which to extract the resources. How does that model strike a balance between environmental stewardship, community needs, and mining firm needs?
So thank you, Rachel. Great question, because for us in mining, for us in energy, there are practical components to how we develop and why we develop, and practical components to the balance between the environment and the balance between what we're doing as a company and for our shareholders. And truly, when we looked at Railveyor was just this incredibly unique technology. And us at KWG, we're pivoting. I have the fortune to work with Tony Marqueux, who is a leader in this area. And Tony really guided all of us in seeking that balance between the environment, and the least impact to the environment was in the heart of why we picked this transportation, why we evaluate it. So between KWG and Cormorant Utility, we are conducting a CapEx study around transportation and Railveyor. We truly felt that this was the least, this could have the least effect on the environment. And this was done through a data-driven process. This was done through an analysis. This was done through really looking at the environment, looking at the technology, looking at what was appropriate for the region, and to make the least impact on the environment. This was a driver in why we picked this technology. But in addition to that, it wasn't just the technology, it's the opportunity and vision. I absolutely believe that Indigenous communities should be owning this. I absolutely believe that this technology and this particular transportation corridor should be owned by the Indigenous communities. I say that here, and I say that at a board level as well. So we are doing the data-driven approach. We are doing the data-driven analysis, but we have a vision at the end that says Indigenous communities can, should, and hope that they will own this.
Miigwech, Fiona, those are the questions that we have for you today. I'm not sure whether there are any questions from the audience.
Well, Masi Cho, Rachel, for sharing today as well. And this was a wonderful opportunity to share what we're doing at KWG, to share what we're doing at Cormorant Utility and PowerTel in the North. We feel heavily invested in the North, and as a Northern person, but more North, I absolutely understand the uniqueness of the territory and the uniqueness of the people, and and that approach from a corporate perspective. I really value that, and it was a great opportunity today to just share some of those interesting things that we're doing, and a chance to share with other people in the mining sector some of the best practices that we are learning as we evolve through this.
Well, miigwech for the good work that you're doing for us all, Fiona.
Masi Cho, Rachel.
Ladies, outstanding. I think we do have one question so far from Sarah. Fiona, could you please share what kind of reactions you're getting from those outside of KWG when you talk about the shift of to Indigenous ownership?
Well, surprisingly, I would say that people are very receptive. People are extremely receptive right now to learning, and I think that that's not just in the mining sector. I think that shift is about Canadians. There is more of an openness right now to learning about Indigenous nations, and so I'm actually really seeing an openness to that. But in addition to that, I think that sometimes people are also a little surprised about the pivot that we're making, surprised about the approach, and KWG's interest in diversifying its own board of directors. And, those were pieces that people were surprised by, but I think that it really just reflects the leadership that KWG is taking in their own analysis of themselves, and being able to say, you know what, it's time to have the agility to change. And it's okay to make that change. And they are doing it. And I think that my appointment is a reflection of that change. And I think that, for those outside of KWG, I hope that people see that change. And I hope that other mining companies also become open to having Indigenous people or having racialized people sit on their boards. And we, in order to be a sector leader, it sometimes means that you need to step out and step up. And that's what we're trying to do at KWG and at Cormorant Utility. We're trying to step up, and we're trying to vision forward. And I do see the surprise within the sector, but I think that this is a good surprise.
One of the comments that you made was about surprise. Harvard, there's a study out of Harvard many years ago that talks about communications being the root of about 90% of all problems. And so when you use the word surprise, do you also feel that there is a need, if you will, for a more robust communications, I'll call it infrastructure, to make sure that people are informed? We live in a world where we have access to more information than ever before, yet things that seem to be important to people, whether it's First Nations communities or communities outside of First Nations, seem to be less informed than they should be, given the information that should be at their fingertips. How can you solve that issue, if it's solvable in the context of what we're talking about today?
Well, thank you, Kevin. Absolutely, communications is this key. It's a key to, why did I do today? Why did I agree to be on the panel today? I agreed to be on the panel because I felt that it was important to share. It's important to communicate what our vision is. It's important to communicate our position from a Cormorant perspective, but also from a KWG perspective. And you know what? I think that as an effective communicator, I absolutely felt that the message that I'm trying to convey in the sector could be broadly digested through an avenue like today. And it was an opportunity for people to ask questions from somebody like myself, who apparently we're only 7 that sit on the board of directors across Canada. It was a chance for people to ask good questions. And I think communication is the key, because sometimes we're in a relationship, and that's relationships all across our lives, where we don't communicate well, and then there's a misunderstanding that transpires between us. But yet the outcome and the goal that we have with each other could be exactly the same. And that's where, I truly believe that, some of the work that I do is being a bridge in that communication, is being a bridge between my own communities and what we're visioning, and corporate communities, and then particularly at a board level, to be able to share at a leadership level and at an executive level what Indigenous communities are looking for and what's happening across the country. There are some amazing Indigenous-owned projects that are transpiring all across the country. And I look at what the Tahltan are doing with the Golden Triangle in the mining sector. They are visioning forward for their own nation in northern British Columbia, for their own people. They have equity in a mine as well. Their approach has just been really tailored to their people. And I just really find that sometimes across the sector, we're not aware of what's happening outside of our region. And instead, when you take a national perspective about what's transpiring, you actually are seeing a huge amount of Indigenous ownership and participation all across the country. And the impact that we're making in the economy, the impact that we're making in the sector is really, it is our time now. And it is our time to participate in a whole new way. And our participation is only as great as our vision is. And that is both Indigenous communities and corporate communities. So absolutely, communication will be the key. Why I do this kind of work is because of my opportunity to communicate today on a platform to all the people I can't see out there because we're on Zoom. So I don't know how many of you are out there, but
well, we have close to 50 people that are logged on to this presentation, and I know that it's being recorded, so we're going to be able to share it broadly with as many people as possible. Earlier this year, I finished a project on behalf of Five Nations Energy here in northeastern Ontario, and the history of Five Nations Energy. The very first Indigenous-owned hydroelectric utility in Canada. Nobody knows about it. It's not taught in schools. If you ask somebody in Manitoba or Quebec, have you ever heard of Five Nations Energy? They'll go, no. What is that? Is it a drink? Can you buy that at the corner store? No, it's not a power drink. It's actually the first Indigenous-owned hydroelectric utility in Canada. And when I circle back to the issue of communications, I always find that I'll repeat the statement that I made, that we're less informed than we should be about these things. And it should be taught in schools. It should be taught specifically to Indigenous kids that, hey, wow, there's this remarkable project that started in the early 1990s that has blazed the trail for things like Watay Power and others, to come.
Absolutely. And I really, the work that Pat Shilton is doing, I'm inspired. And sometimes we don't get a chance to say that from a corporate perspective. I am inspired by the work that Pat is doing. I think as an Indigenous woman coming up in the field as well, I look to Five Nations Energy, Watay and Kiniak Power as being examples of where we could be going, what we could be doing. I took those good lessons with me as I visioned around my work at KWG. As a matter of fact, when I joined Cormorant Utility, Pat was one of the first people to reach out and to say congratulations. We're in a small sector. We are not in a very large sector. And so, many of us know each other and can support each other in the development of what we're doing around utilities and Indigenous ownership. Love what they're doing at Five Nations Energy. Absolutely inspired by Pat.
In my mind, as I look at we're just waiting for people. We've got 45 people in here, 47 people. So if you have any questions, type them in. Please type them in, and we'll get them to either Rachel or to Fiona this morning. I think about Five Nations Energy and Wate. Those are the keys to the kingdom, so to speak, right now. If exploration companies, juniors, majors that are looking to partner with juniors and so on and so forth, understand that there is this infrastructure there now that can help solve some of those big issues around power. The EAs, as you said, need to be First Nation led and controlled, understandably. And there's an enormous body of knowledge there already that can be built upon. That it's not this daunting process because the knowledge is there. It just needs to be brought to the table and discussed in a robust fashion. Is that a fair assessment?
Absolutely, that's a fair assessment. And I think that speaks to the communications part that you had illustrated, is that, when people realize that that infrastructure is there, that knowledge is there, this has already been done. This is something that is tried and true. And you know what, we can take the lessons learned from that and really integrate that into our path forward. And I think that that's why I share around Rachael, around the ownership of that, and potentially even for the Ring of Fire around the creation of a utility there. That is something that can be done. That is something that is realistic for the Indigenous nations that are participating in the Ring of Fire and have ownership, and is their land. Truly, a utility could be, if visioned by those communities, a way forward. And, I think Wate and Five Nations have led the way. I applaud what Margaret and Frank McKay are doing with the communities. And as a CEO of a utility, inspired. Like, those are such good words to think when you look at both of them. And I think the mining sector is starting to really see how we can work together with the infrastructure that's transpiring in the north. And, certainly even larger stakeholders like Hydro One are also, a part of that dialogue and discussion, a part of visioning forward. That's also, with the IESO. All of these groups are a part of, how we really develop the north in a comprehensive fashion, but with a respectful approach to Indigenous communities. And that really, I think that really is the key. Like you said, the key to the kingdom is in really strong relationships based on respect and understanding, with a clear outcome to where we're all trying to go. My work at Cormorant Utility with Indigenous nations, I am learning every day. I'm learning every day about the innovation that First Nations have around their business models. Last week I was with Mississinapi Cree First Nations just outside of Sault Ste. Marie. Amazed by the model and approach that they have for the region. Amazed by their chief and leadership and the CEO of their Economic Development Corporation. Just when you think there's not room for innovation, somebody shows you there's so much more room left. Really appreciated that great visit. I learned on that visit. It wasn't my time to teach, it was my time to learn. So thank you so much.
We're scheduled to have a break right about now, and it's a 15-minute break, but we do have one more question that has popped up here in the chat. What kind of supports or processes need to be in place to support and enable the shift beyond being just open to it, capacity building and access to capital?
So I think that, there's already an infrastructure in place for access to capital. You look at the Canada Infrastructure Bank, they have a whole Indigenous unit being led by Hilary Thatcher. She's doing a great job in Indigenous partnerships. I think you can also see through the First Nations Finance Authority. The First Nations Finance Authority is doing this excellent work in equity for First Nations and financing. Those are both national organizations. I think that, you know, I look to I can't speak for other people, but I can just say that, you know, both at KWG, Cormorant, and PowerTel, you know, when they shifted to include an Indigenous leader within the organization, that created a space at the executive level to be able to affect that change, being led by an Indigenous person who had a knowledge about the sector, but also had a knowledge base about Indigenous partnerships across the country. My position here was to effect that change and to create that culture shift within the organization, which would then impact the shift with our external partners and our approach around Indigenous joint ventures and Indigenous ownership. So it's an example of how we're stepping out in what we're doing. You know, within the team that I lead here, we actually have a P3 expertise. We have a former power investment banker from Bay Street. He was on Bay Street for 25 years. We've actually brought him into the team here, not because we're seeking ownership, but because we absolutely know Indigenous nations are seeking ownership. And we wanted to ensure that when they had questions about what ownership looked like and about what that would cost in the long run and what that model would be, that we could answer those questions. That, you know, as we're making large decisions from a chief and council about infrastructure ownership, infrastructure investment, that we could answer those key questions. And that's where, you know, a lot of times in the work that we do in Indigenous strategy, people aren't necessarily thinking about having a P3 expert on the team. They're not necessarily thinking about the financing and financial modeling that goes around ownership as well. But we absolutely understood that there is no way that Indigenous nations could understand what kind of projects that they were looking at without that kind of key expertise. And for us, it was an investment. Because we're not seeking ownership. We're looking at power solutions for Indigenous nations and our partners, and also for other utilities in the sector that we work with. We wanted to ensure that we built a capable team here to answer all the questions that Indigenous communities had. So that's where we stepped out of what was traditionally comfortable for us and expanded, because we just knew that those were the questions that we were receiving from Indigenous communities. How do we own? And when we couldn't answer those questions, we brought in a key person on the Indigenous strategy team to answer those questions.
I've had the good fortune of being closely, I'm not going to say connected, but aware of developments, if you will, in both Northeastern, Northwestern Ontario as a longtime writer. So I think the tide is turning, obviously in the right direction. There's little doubt about that. So Fiona, thank you so much for your time this morning. Rachel, thank you for facilitating a great conversation. You teased out of Fiona exactly what everybody here not only was here to hear about, but they needed to hear what Fiona had to say this morning. So Rachel, thank you so much for facilitating that conversation.
You're most welcome, Kevin. My pleasure. Thank you,
Outstanding.
Fiona.
Message
Ladies,
to both of you.
Yes, thank you. So, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to take a break, and we're going to come back at the bottom of the hour with Jason Thompson, the owner of Superior Strategies, and of course, to wrap things up for the sessions, the one and only Brian Davey of the Anishinaabe Development Fund is going to be here with us to wrap up our presenter sessions here at the Mining the Northwest virtual trade show. Once again, ladies, thank you for being here. We're going to go ahead and close the room. Thank you to everyone, and we will see you at the bottom of the hour. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.